containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, with Egypt for the mouthpiece and Africa as the birthplace.
Both of these two words, one means labor and another means servant. So none of these words mean slave. But at the top of this article, he says slavery existed in Egypt since the Old Kingdom. I mean, at the end of at the end of the day, I could just end the argument here. Okay, I mean, we could end it right here and just leave it at that because we already see the contradiction that's going on, and this is typical of the this scholarship that we are seeing, right? So, but we're going to continue a little bit longer, right? Because there's a lot to unpack here. So, documented evidence exists as early as the reign of Senefru in the 26th century BCE war campaigns in the territory of Nubia, in which war captives would be labeled squena and Libyans of all of whom would be used to perform labor, regardless of their will, otherwise or if warranted, whatever that means. I have no idea. So I mean, as far as I know, if you capture prisoners of war and you put them in what they call labor camps, I mean that's a common thing here in the 20th, 21st, 22nd century. So I mean, I'm not sure. To that, does that mean they're slaves because they're in labor camps? But anyway, let's continue. So he says. He says here, Libya and Libyans, all of whom would be used to perform labor regardless of their will otherwise or if warranted. So I'm supposed he's talking about the Libyan prisoners of war, would be conscripted into the military. So again, they're conscripted into the military. Are they slaves because they're conscripted into the military? I mean, we have conscription here in America. Okay, I mean, all over the world, the armies conscript people. They draft people into the army. Okay, that's conscription. But does that mean that the draftees, that's been conscripted are slaves? But here in this, here they're slaves because it's in Egypt, right? So they must be slaves. But let's continue. Reliefs from this period depict captured prisoners of war with their hands tied behind their back. I'll just show you some pictures of that. Behind their backs. Nubia was targeted because of its close geographical proximity, cultural similarity, and competitiveness in imperial dominion, and then the scope of campaigns intended to acquire foreign war captives expanded to Libya and Asia. Local Kemites also entered into servitude due to unstable economy and debt. Officials who abused their power would also be reduced to servitude. So that's pretty interesting, right? So they call it servitude. So I know, for example, so like you said, people abuse their power, and also people that had debt, they could end up in what they call servitude, or what these people are trying to imply was slavery. So here now, for example, say you commit a crime here in America, and they give you community service. Okay, so you gotta go somewhere for 2 weeks or even 2 years. Sometimes you on probation for 2 years or 3 years. People are sometimes in what they call a house arrest. You can't leave your. So my question: would that be considered slavery? If this is what's going on in ancient Egypt, what we could see from here, but is that's considered slavery in ancient Egypt, but it's not slavery here in America, right? But let's continue. I mean, this is very interesting, right? So it says here during the first intermediate period, slaves again, no slaves in Egypt, but he's continuing to reinforce the idea that there was slaves in Egypt, right? Even though everything that he said so far above here had nothing to do with slavery, but he's again reinforcing the idea that there was slavery. Okay, even though what he's describing is not slavery. But let's continue. Slaves were first defined as, he says, during the first intermediate period, slaves were first defined as men with dignity. but remain treated as property. When so imagine that. So wow, this is amazing. When borrowed money owed to wealthier individuals in the Egyptian society could not be paid back, family members were sold in return into slavery, especially women during the Middle Kingdom. Records show that coerced, again, is another word he's using, coerced, as as opposed to slavery, but again, he's calling it coerced laborers. That it showed that coerced laborers included conscripts, prisoners of war, or draftees, uh, and royal laborers. Uh, the rise. So let me read that again because it's very. It says during the Middle Kingdom, records show that coerced laborers, including conscript, fugitives, and royal laborers. Okay, so we have a couple of terms here. We have coerced laborers, including conscripts, HSBW, HSB, whatever, however you pronounce that. Fugitives, okay, people that ran away from their responsibilities, I would suppose. But they're probably implying that they're slaves here. And royal laborers. Okay, none of these words mean slave, right? None of the words that he just mentioned mean slave, but he's going to interpret them as slaves. The Reisner Papyrus and the El Lahun Papyri depict prisoners being employed in state enterprises. Okay, so here you have prisoners of war being, which would be equivalent to like state enterprise would be equivalent to the federal government here, right? These are state enterprises or federal enterprise. The state government would be, I guess the equivalent here would be federal government workers, right? So here you have uh, prisoners, uh, you know, uh, being employed as federal workers. So these federal workers, he's calling them slaves, right? All right, let's continue. He said the Reisner Papyrus and the El Lahun Papyri depict prisoners being employed in state enterprises. Papyrus Brooklyn 35 also shows forced labor being performed on arable state land. If an individual coerced into labor attempted to escape or was absent from their work, they might be condemned to coerced labor for life. Okay, let's look at that. So here he's saying that if an individual uh, attempted to escape or was absent from their work, but again, they might be condemned to coerced labor for life, which is so. Is that slavery? I mean, that is so. Again, this whole idea of slavery seems redundant. It doesn't. It seems anachronistic, right? Because we here, from what we're talking about now, he's talking about coerced labor, and he keep using that word coerced because, again, there is no slavery, right? So he's using the word coerced. So I guess if you do community service, if you're a fugitive, or if you're a debt, took on some debt that you couldn't pay back, and they took you to court and they tell you to pay the money and you didn't want to pay, you end up in jail. So now you're doing, they might put you on community service, and so you have to do this community service. And so if you run away from the community service and don't do what they're gonna do, they're gonna track you down and capture you and put you back in jail. Okay, but here it looks like they don't have any jail, so they just, you know, so basically, instead of putting you in jail, they just put you to work. Okay, so but let's continue. Uh, One of the El Lahun papyri describes an example of this occurring. Order issued by the great president in the year 31, third month of the summer season, day 5, that he be condemned with all his family to labor for life on state land. According to the decision of the court, military expeditions. So he's quoting something here about we don't know why this person was condemned to and his family was condemned to uh, labor for life, but they were condemned to work on state land or federal land uh, for life, supposedly by the decision of the court. So this was a court ordered situation. Okay. So we don't know if this guy committed a crime, right, or not, or whatever he did. Just like here in America, if you commit a crime, if it's bad enough, you get sentenced for life, to life, and life, and some people get sentenced to death, as opposed to life. So now, if you commit a crime in America and you are sentenced to jail, would that mean that you are a slave? Especially if you're sentenced for life, would that mean that now you can be considered a slave? So if that's the case, that would mean that we have a lot of slaves in America, right? In jail, right? These are basically slaves if you go by this interpretation, right? Because this is what they're saying. But let's continue. So military expeditions continued to reduce Asiatics to slavery, and state-owned slaves, royal laborers. So he's saying here that Asiatics were reduced to slavery as state-owned slaves working as royal laborers, right? Working for the federal government of that time, state government, right? So here, let's read this carefully. Military expeditions continued to reduce Asiatics to slavery, and state-owned slaves, royal laborers, shared in the same status as these Asiatic slaves. So here he's saying that the royal workers, right? That's what laborers are, workers. He's saying that the royal workers shared the same status as these Asiatic slaves. Suppose, quote unquote, suppose. So aren't these Asiatics actually laborers? Would they be considered laborers? Why are these Asiatics considered laborers? But the royal, why are these Asiatics considered to be slaves if they have the same status as the royal laborers, the royal workers? I mean, this is really strange, But let's continue. So imagine that slaves having the same status as royal as federal workers. So imagine if in America back in the time of slavery, uh, the people working for the government would have the same status as the Africans that was enslaved. So how would the Africans be slaves if they had the same status as the people that's working for the federal government? But this is where we are. This is called scholarship. But let's continue. Asiatics could often have Egyptian names, but sometimes inscriptions or papyri mention them would still apply an ethnic qualification, such as one which mentioned an Asiatic Aduna and her son Anku. Both Asiatics and state-owned slaves could perform a variety of jobs, right? Because they had the same status, right? The royal laborers. So here he's calling the royal laborers state-owned slaves, right? The royal workers, he's calling them. He's back to calling them slaves now. So he's jumping between slave and worker. Okay, both Asiatics and state-owned slaves could perform a variety of jobs. We find royal labor. So again, you see what I'm talking about? We find royal laborers. Then over here he calls them state-owned slaves, but he's back to calling them royal laborers again. We find royal laborers employed as field workers, house servants, and cobblers, female laborers as hairdressers, gardeners, and weavers. If a household servant failed to adequately perform their job, they could be dismissed from the home they worked at. Okay, well, I mean, if you work here in America as a maid in a house and you fail to perform adequately, they dismiss you. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's just the way it works. I mean, that's So what makes these people slaves? But anyway, in some cases, so I mean, if they're going to dismiss you, right, slaves don't get dismissed from a. You get dismissed from a job, not from slavery. Okay, but this is the contradiction that we see. In some cases, servants appear to have become emotionally important to their household, as depicted in the Cairo Bowl. And the Cairo Bowl is some reference he's making. Laperina, Antonia, Slavery, Servitude, USLA Encyclopedia of Egyptology. Same here they go describing this as slavery again. I mean, this is ridiculous. Okay, let's continue with this. One of the Berlin papyri showed that by the time of Second Intermediate Period, a slave could be owned by both an elite individual like the king and the community. In addition, the community had grown in power and now held the capacity to own and to organize, to administer the public property, including that of slaves, replacing, again, we talk about workers, not slaves, but let's continue, replacing some of the traditional power of the king and his private royal workers or laborers, right? So, so basically, what they're showing you here when they say replacing the power of the king and his private, we are seeing a dichotomy between uh, private and state enterprises. Okay, so we are seeing a private. We are looking at the private labor market and the what you call state labor, state workers or federal workers, right? This is the economy they're saying, but they're calling them slaves. So what we are seeing really, when we really examine this and really read between the lines, what we are seeing is that the division of labor in ancient Egypt was no different than it is right here in America today. Okay, I mean this is what it comes down to. But we're gonna continue to see that as we go along. Uh, that's where we left off at. It says, It says, in addition, the community had grown in power, you know, and now held the capacity to own and administer the public property, including that of slaves, replacing some of the traditional power of the king and his private royal laborers. By this period, slaves could also sometimes become citizens. One method by which this could happen was through marriage. So imagine slaves becoming citizens through marriage in America. Okay, uh, but I mean, did that happen? Could that have happened? Maybe. Who knows? But these. So again, this so-called slavery they talk about is not really slavery. But we're gonna continue. During the New Kingdom period, the military expenses grew, and so additional coerced labor was needed to sustain it. As such, the New Kingdom, with its relentless military operations in this epoch of large scale foreign slavery, again with the slavery, many more slaves were acquired via the Mediterranean slave market. So, this is an interesting topic. So, here we are learning that the Egyptians were acquiring workers from the Mediterranean slave markets. Okay, so they had actually had slave markets in the Mediterranean. Like I guess we're talking about we all know what the Mediterranean is, so we don't need to explain that. He says many of the slaves were also acquired by the Mediterranean slave market, where Egypt was the main purchaser of international slaves. So that this was an international business, right? They're claiming. This Mediterranean market appears to have been controlled by the Asiatic Bedouins. The Bedouins. So what we'd call, the Bedouins like we see in Syria and different parts of the Mediterranean right now. So who would capture individuals such as travelers and sell them on the market. The tomb, the tomb of Amos I contains a biographical text which depicts several boasts regarding the capture of foreign Asiatic slaves. Egyptian servants would again, see the dichotomy. He's saying they were. He's saying here that uh, foreign Asiatic slaves. He's saying Amos 1. He says, let me go from the beginning. The tomb of Amos 1 contains a biographical text which depicts several boasts regarding the capture of foreign Asiatic slaves. Egyptian servants were treated more humanely as employees, whereas foreign slaves were the objects of trade. The foreigners captured during military campaigns are, for example, referred to in the annals of Thutmose III as men in captivity, and individuals were referred to as dependents. And in reward of his services in the construction of temples across Egypt, Thutmose III rewarded his official Menmos over 150 dependents. During and after the reign of Amenhotep II, coerced temple labor was only performed by male and female slaves. So he's saying here, they refer to these people as dependents, not slaves. Okay, so what is a dependent? I mean, a dependent was somebody that you have to take care of, right? So we call our children dependents. Okay, they are our dependents. Okay, or somebody that you're responsible for their care, they're your dependent. They're dependent on you for their care or for their, living or for whatever, like older elderly people that might be dependent on you, their dependents, right? So this is what they're referring to as slaves, right? Because these, so for example, these 150 dependents that Thutmose III gave to his uh, his official, he had to take care of these people, right? So these people were depending on this Mimos to be taken care of. You had to find them work or find them things to do. That's what they were. They were his dependents. I mean, but this is what they're calling slaves, right? Again, they're interpreting these things as slavery. All right. It says here during. Okay, we already read that part about during and after the reign of Amenhotep II, coerced or temple labor. Coerced or they're calling it coerced. They're calling the labor coerced, and temple labor was only performed by male and female slaves. At Medinet Habu, defeated sea peoples are recorded as having been captured as prisoners of war and reduced to slavery. During this period, slaves could sometimes be rented. One manuscript known as the Harris Papyrus I records Ramses III claiming to have captured innumerable foreign slaves. I brought back in great numbers those that my sword had spared, with their hands tied behind their backs, before my horses, and their wives and children in tens of thousands, and their livestock in hundreds of thousands. I imprisoned their leaders in fortresses bearing my name, and I added to them chief archers and tribal chiefs, branded and enslaved, tattooed with my name, their wives and children being treated in the same way. In the adoption papyrus, the term slave servant is contrasted with the term free citizen, nim, of the land of Pharaoh. Often the phrase nim traditionally refers to an orphan or a poor, which would work in line with the term dependent, right? As we saw above. Methods by which slaves could attain their freedom included marriage or entering temple service, being purified or being purified. The latter is depicted in, for example, the restoration stela of Tutankhamun. The Ramesside Egypt saw a development in the institution of slavery where slaves could now become objects of private rather than public property, and they would be bought and sold. Slaves themselves could now own some property and had a few legal protections, although there were not many. So the slaves had legal protection, but what we are seeing here basically, these people are not slaves; they're just workers, and they have legal protection. Just like any worker today have legal protection. Not much today either. Uh, so here they're saying that they had a few legal protections, although there were not many. That would describe working people of today, especially unionized working people. They might have a few protection, but labor for the most part don't have not many protection here in America. I mean, we can go back to the labor struggles that's been going on from the 1920s, right? So let's continue. Uh, Type of coerced labor, chattel slavery. The chattel slaves were mostly captives of war, so they're calling the captive of war, prisoners of war, chattel slaves, and were brought to different cities and countries to be sold as slaves. All countries, all captives, including civilians, not a part of military forces, were seen as a royal resource. The pharaoh could resettle these captives by moving them into colonies of labor, giving them to our temples, giving them as rewards to deserving individuals, or giving them to his soldiers as loot. Some chattel slaves began as free people who were found guilty of committing illicit acts, or they were prisoners, and were forced to give up their freedom. Other chattel slaves were born into the life from a slave mother. So again, this is very dubious here. So you're saying that some so-called chattel slaves, uh, you know, were given to different people, and a lot of people would become could become slaves by committing guilty, illegal acts, and were forced to give up their freedom, which is no different than here in America, where if you commit a crime, you have to give up your freedom, and if the crime is big enough, and odorous enough, you give up your freedom for life. And if it's even bigger than that or more odorous than that, you're put to death. Okay, you'll be executed. I mean, so far I haven't seen anything about any of these slaves being executed yet. I haven't read anything about that, about execution or being one of the punishments for the crimes of these people that were quote unquote slaves. But we know that here in America, during slavery and in Europe, your life was at the whim of the slave master. There was no legal protection. There was no laws protecting you. But here in Egypt, we have actual laws that these actual so-called slaves could appeal to. Okay, even though they claim it was not many, but they had laws. So again, how could that be? But again, let's continue.
Containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, with Egypt for the mouthpiece and Africa as the birthplace.